And the dangers of snuff now being incontrovertible, I don't think there's any need for us to say any more about that. And the kind of examples that we have used about the primary world and the secondary world and the world of acts and the world of facts, which are all sort of, if you understand, kind of synonymous. And then trying to pull out examples which normally use other forms of life on this planet, non-human, and then drawing some sort of metaphorical parallel, and then always coming along and saying, well, now wait a minute, this does not mean that man is in some way really similar in life and behavior to a dog or a chimpanzee. Holy Mother, I've been doing that as long as anybody on this planet, and I'm sick of it. See, for one reason, though, it's like when you're childish, you're trying to talk to people, and their first time listening, you try to say such things as to keep them from getting all involved with, wait a minute, is this whole idea going to be that we're nothing but maybe orangutans with a good haircut? Are you insinuating that I may be a forest gorilla with a high school education? And even us here, we have taken some of that apparently into account and tried to keep people from jumping to conclusions, but you know, what the hell? Lemmings jump, why not you? Well, it's an old story. There have been people as far back as, people real far back, that have written and tried to, philosophers and fabulists, that have tried to draw comparisons and tried to point out something that they observed about human behavior, and then tried, since there was nothing, you know, there's nothing else to compare humans with. It's not like you got parallel groups of humans ordinary minds can see, so you start thinking, well, wait a minute, I'm trying to make a point here. And some of the early Greeks at first tried to compare man to fig trees, and that didn't work. Then they tried it with cisterns and some of their sewerage projects, and that didn't work. And so then they came up with the idea of comparing man's behavior to the behavior of wolves and lions. And so it seemed to work better because even the ordinary could go, well, I can in some way see something about, for instance, the social behavior of lions and then humans as opposed to some of the activities of aqua filters and some of the more civic projects that they undertook there in Athens and Rome. But at any rate, we got to be past the point of worry about whether you're going to get involved with, wait a minute, this is in some way offensive to man. That's back to the Kyroot that those who most fear being intellectually offended, or that fear the most intellectually, have the least to fear. And I'm just sorry, that's just it. If you're worried about being intellectually taken advantage of, if you're the kind of person that would say, wait a minute, I believe that I'm being intellectually insulted. Anything along those lines. If you feel that way, it's possible. Well, it is possible. But I'm just going to point out to you just once and for all, if you got any ability to think on your own, ideas about, well, wait a minute, I'm being intellectually insulted. If you can be intellectually insulted, I can be crude and put it this way, you deserve it. There is, without any doubt, a useful and operative connection between behavior of other living creatures on this planet and man. And it is not untoward whatsoever to talk about cutting off man at the kind of line in the nervous system from the bringing on up where man has produced this secondary intellectual world, and to say that there is a direct, incontrovertible, irresistible, parallel connection, metaphorical, symbolic, and perhaps even otherwise, from here down, what we've been calling the necessary world, the primary world, the world of acts. It's only just ordinary people that can take offense, either intellectually, or if they're real old and coarse, they can take offense and say, wait a minute, this is ungodly, or this is insulting to the spirit of man. That's the kind of people who worry about whether they in fact are worthy of more respect than a beaver or a hippo. If you ever think about it, it's not just funny, it's not sarcastic. People who really worry that, wait a minute, I don't want to hear more about this, or I don't want to read a book. We need to have some sort of censorship. We'll change the name of it, but we need to have some kind of control here in the city for the decency of civilized, cultured people. We can't have men running around expressing ideas saying that there is some quite real and valid parallel, some kinship between men and orangutans. That's offensive to the gods. Think about it. Think if you're the kind, and this is not an attack on people, because I'm sure some of you have got relatives, family, that would say that. No, you do. The same way that you got relatives and family that's religious, and it's no offense to them. But recognize the fact that out in life, in the institutional, collective area of ordinary life, there are people who are offended, seriously, that want to take up arms, that want to shut up other people, on the basis that, wait, you cannot compare in some way. Don't even insinuate that there might be some kind of real parallel between the lives of feral beast and man, because man has a soul. If you say, well, there's not that much difference. Then you're into an area that's not just intellectual offense. They take it as being religious blasphemy. Oh, no. But now think about it. Of course, they got a story, as always. I'm just talking to you. I'm not talking to them. We're not trying to convert them because they're not wrong. But think about someone all dressed up, intelligent, educated, and they're not just intellectually offended now. We're not just talking about people who say, wait a minute, I don't want to be intellectually taken advantage of. We're talking about people now who say, now this is a wider, more metaphysical question, and they do not want to be lumped in. They do not want to hear that there is some connection between man and rhinoceri. And they say, no, this is far beyond any intellectual argument. Men are not pigs. They're not beasts. They're not cows. We have a soul. Think about that. Whether it be true or not. What kind of soul, what kind of person is it that says, wait, I am grossly offended. How dare you compare me to a cow? Think about it. As I said, though, life is arranged in such a way because it's supposed to keep things moving a certain way. They have a story. If you tried to hold them down, if you were that dumb and stupid yourself and say, wait a minute, don't you see what you're doing? If you are, let's assume, you say that man is just, it's incomparable. There's no connection between man. God made man, God like man, and a bovine. All right, you say it's true. The man says, yes, it says right here in my Bible, my Quran. All right. Well, if that's true, then why are you upset? I mean, whoever said that's got to be just an absolute idiot. Why are you upset? Well, God don't want you to do that. You understand? That ordinarily, that's part of still the friction that keeps things running, is they cannot see anything amiss. They don't see anything at all. May I be so bold as to say, sort of humorous? That you cannot compare man. You do include yourself. Well, yes. You cannot compare man to cows, pigs. Why would they care? There is a valid connection, of course, or people would not care. Back to where all of this started tonight. I like facial gestures that had nothing to do with anything. I know some of you laughed, and I thought, why in the world are they laughing? Because nobody... Maybe I underestimate our audiences. Yes, that has nothing whatsoever to do with real life, does it? No, because one thing, have you ever noticed, cows, pigs, rhinoceri, they have no facial expressions. Take a lesson from that. Got it. There is, without any doubt, to make it short and try to catch up, to start tonight, cut man off at the top of the nervous system, at the bottom of the brainstem. Take away a man's mind. Take away the intellect functioning enough to talk. Then you would not have a secondary world. It's not anthropological science fiction. And it's not Darwinism put in a classic comic book. It's none of that. All that's a crude version. You've got to see it for yourself or you can't see it. But there would be a quite valid, a real extant connection of man's primary world, and the world of cattle, beast. It's not that different. You are operating off of the same kind of hormones, the same kind of genetics, and of course, as some of you, it's not the point, but you're not that far removed from space debris, comets and stars. We're unique. God made us. It says right here in my little Bible that I stole from the motel. It says that I am a unique person. That's right, sir. Your genes are not exactly the same as an orangutan. Well, I knew that. No, they're not exactly the same. Well, I said I knew that. Yeah, they're not exactly the same. Well, I knew that. And they're not exactly the same as moon rocks. Oh, hell, I knew that. Not exactly the same, no. I knew that. It's not the same as water. Oh, I knew that. Or argon gas. Well, I knew all that. Don't keep on with that. All right. But if you begin to picture yourself, for yourself, that you have, and it's not just a vertical metaphor, it's not just man's nervous system coming up to this point and suddenly he blossomed out. I mean, that's one way to describe it, but the relative life runs vertical and horizontal, and I might suggest in several other directions. At least 3. It's obvious if you got a nose that even works. But what has happened now, and is still using words and sound waves and your eardrums, it would appear to be directional in operation, and it's not, but you got to talk and words have to go in some direction anyway. But it would appear to be that man, let's say up to here, was an orangutan, very close. But then he gets an intellect that can talk, and he leaves everything else in this 3-dimensional closet on one basis. Not a soul, not because he got a Bible, not because he now has discount coupons. This, only this. Anything else is a dream. All the other dreams of infinite worlds are real for ordinary people because their dreams of infinite worlds are, according to Kyroots, what? They are his infinite worlds. But there is only one thing that is real here that distinguishes man from anything else, and it's this. And it grows. It doesn't simply spring from nowhere like a man in a raincoat and socks cut off at the top or pants that leaps out of a dark alleyway. He didn't just suddenly appear here. You cannot take the flower out of the soil. You cannot take man's brain away from everything else. And the brain is going to resemble the aroma of the flower, as you all have pointed out to me, will always resemble the smell of the fertilizer, the smell of the soil itself. There is no cutoff line to say that there is a discrete distinction between man and all other animals, and that the distinction is discrete on the basis that there is a quantum change in him. It's true and it's not true. It is true that this alone is the difference between you and certain other living creatures. This and only that. And so you can say that it is an on and off proposition. It is an either or, except for this. The part that you have in common with them is just as necessary. It's inescapable to cause this. Do you see? There's no kind of good description, no valid description in the 3D world. Science and its further theoretical realms just barely can come up with anything to express this. But you understand that there is, say above this line, this absolutely, without any doubt, unconditionally distinguishes you, and this alone, from an orangutan, from everybody else that has a necessary physical world on this planet. And you can say, all right. But then you can say, wait a minute, this is the actual cutoff point. And yet it's not, because you cannot cut it off were it not for what's below it. That which you have in common, you wouldn't have this. And so it is discrete, it is observably distinctive, and yet it's not. It would be the only, I still say it's the best, I suggest to you, that you can look at a flower, you look at a rose and say, that rose is not the same thing as horse manure. Or it's not the same thing as this soil. It's simply not. Nothing wrong with the soil, but that is not the rose. But if you take the rose out of the soil, what you got? You got a dead flower. You do not have a rose any longer. This is distinctive, discrete. It is a quantum move from the primary world to the secondary. But the distinction is one of illusion. It is a grand, convenient hallucination. If there is a real distinction and you could exercise it, it would be, again, may I suggest to you, a form of suicide. It would be a form of suicide for humanity. Could they do it? And since they can't, is why, may I further suggest, was the origins of science fiction, sometimes also known as religion in its earlier stages. The idea is that someday men will be nothing but living brains. They'll just sit over there on a chair and... Well, I know religion makes it sound another way, but these old ideas that came out, I assume they're still going on, movies back in the 50s, that someday men would get so advanced, there would be nothing but a brain over there in some kind of little jar. And it would just be there. But why are they saying that? They're saying he wouldn't have to eat, he wouldn't have to sleep, he wouldn't have to put up with, finding if it was a man talking, he wouldn't have to put up with women, always getting in his way and telling me not to flick ashes on the floor and to come home early. In other words, free from sex, free from the necessary world, free from the primary world. That is a dream. I mean, you can have a brain in a bottle. We can do it. But you do understand, I assume that we're all on the same line here. If we took you and put your brain in a bottle, I must tell you that, how shall I put this delicately? I think there's every possibility in the world that would prove to be fatal to you. You understand? We say, well, there it is, a brain in a bottle. And in fact, I know for a fact, I don't recognize the person, but I know that that is Fred. Because I was there when they took it out. There is Fred. Where's the rest of Fred? Well, Fred went to live with Jesus. The rest of him. And this part's dead too, but at least we got separate. In case you hadn't noticed, that is still, they would put it under another guise, but it's still the same thing. That is man's idea of heaven. All forms of heaven, paradise, Arcadia, the Elysian fields, going to, well, I started to say Valhalla, but that seems to, when people hear about what the Norse seem to considered to be a form of heaven, many people go, Jesus Christ, give me a break. Which I guess is one reason that never got all that popular throughout the world. But I've known people that heard a bit about the early Norse mythological ideas of what heaven was, like going to be with, living in Valhalla, waiting around for the inevitable end. And I've known people that heard about that and got so depressed they went, well, if I had my choice, I'd rather go spend eternity with Wagner. So I guess it gets pretty iffy. You cannot separate this from the rest of man. But that was why I started pointing out, that is everyone's idea of heaven. They don't put it that way. But it's exactly, they would say, well, it's where we go and we shed this mortal veil, this weak, carnal body. But they try to, make it sound better, like, well, we'll go where the soul of man never dies. Well, which means, well, you'll never be sick, never be in debt. They can't make you pay those charge cards anymore, those evil bills. But they finally getting around to saying the same thing. It's going to be a brain. You'll be free from what? And they'll dress it up. But they will point out the three big S's. They will describe man's primary world here, and what they're saying is you'll be freed from all that. Which is another way of pointing out, well, you'll be dead. And they go, yeah, but I won't really be. There is a pushing of the horizon. And it is a form of centrifugal force rather than just a horizon, if I may try and expand it. It is like the merry-go-round. But the merry-go-round keeps getting larger and larger, and the way it gets larger and larger is as man's secondary is getting further from the center. Man's primary is not growing. If you looked at the merry-go-round, if we just picked out arbitrarily, let's say, I don't want anybody worrying about it. Let's say X 100,000 years ago that man first, his intellect began to operate. There was the merry-go-round. Since then, the merry-go-round has been getting larger and larger, in a sense, through centrifugal force, if you want to look at it that way for a second. But the merry-go-round, the original part, the primary, is still there. In the fact, the obvious fact, that everyone, there's no doubt about it, man has not changed that much physically. We have the same number of hands, feet, eyes, nose, ears that man had X hundreds of thousand years ago. 9,000 years ago. Try to figure out some figure where there's some kind of cave paintings and little drawings left. Look at that as being the merry-go-round. The physical merry-go-round. But since then, the merry-go-round has taken on a kind of mythical, a kind of metaphorical. How about this? A kind of non-visible. Aha! Intellectual, secondary, outer ring. And it continues to expand. And so notice you can speak about things changing while simultaneously not changing, and it turns out not to be, once you realize it, it turns out not to be a form of crackerjack Zen. Because the merry-go-round there is still where it is. It's supposed to be there. It's supposed to be stable. You're supposed to be reasonably healthy. You're supposed to eat food. You're supposed to sleep. You're supposed to stay out of the cold. Brush your teeth. Comb your hair. Don't put your damn eye out. And at least enough of you screw enough to keep the race going. That's the merry-go-round. That is the extent that people normally live. In the sense that they want to improve themselves. That I'll doctor this thing up. I'll sturdy up. I'll shore up the horses. I'll get my little horses of the swine over here. I'll work it out. I'll make it lose weight, or I'll make it put on muscles. I'll have some hair transplanted on its little head. But this part, the secondary part that is expanding while the other keeps going and going, nobody fools with that. Not individually. They talk about it. And they believe, having that kind of limited vision, that that is the job of education, is why, I assume that you know that it's not just a recent phenomenon, is men, politicians, social critics, and everyone else continue to harp, even carp, not to mention a few people flounder about it, about the absolute necessity of better education. And as soon as somebody says that, then somebody else will point out, well, we can raise taxes again. Oh boy. And we'll build more schools, but something seems strange because most of the kids still don't want to learn. You make them go to school for a while, long enough that they realize, where to find a crack wholesaler, to get into a little business on the side, learn how to pickpocket, learn how to hang out, live off women. And nobody wants to, they don't want to learn anymore. I don't know what the world's coming to. But they still insist. You know this, it's not an attack on it, but you know they continue to say that, well, the answer to, if you ask a politician, and it's not politicians' shortcomings, it's the institutional collective life of man. If you ask a socially aware person, let's say a politician, well, what are we going to do about crime? Well, of course, crime is just a symptom. We've got to get to the problem, the cause of it. And the cause of it is lack of education. What are we going to do about poverty? We have got to educate people. What are we going to do about about the increase of alcoholism and drug addiction? Education, because if people knew better, they wouldn't do it. And it's all education, right? And I assume that you've got 1.5 eyes and realize, or that you can just smell yourself, that this is not quite what it appears to be. Because that is not it. But what it is a reflection of this outer secondary ring from the merry-go-round. It would be over a long range, and it is, of course, an increase in man's thinking ability, a growing preeminence of thought, facts, over acts. That in a sense, as a Kyroot tonight, it is, of course, as always, gradual, but as man's secondary world does expand and flourish, glow, secondary facts begin to actually supplant the facts from which they originally sprang. And there are no secondary facts that did not come from acts. There are no hobbies that did not come from necessities. The most foolish thing people can do, the most stupid, foolish thing people can do, like, collect stamps or play their accordion, came from a fact, came from a necessity. They do not just come from nowhere. But in a sense, you've got to be able to see it. It cannot be described because it's irrational, it's impossible. But they begin to gradually supplant. Not really. But if we said, or if I tried to give you an example, we got a minute or so more?
Yes.
All right, let's take eating. Nowadays, you ordinary people watching this, just sophisticated ordinary people, eating is not just eating. Eating is not much of a big deal. Eating is something as opposed now to dining. Just stuffing your face is something you just do out of necessity. Aha, that sounds familiar. Like you've been working all day on some project that you just had to get finished, and you hadn't even had time to eat, and you finally begin to get dizzy and get a headache from being around, the inside of the office all day, and you've had nothing to eat in your body. A headache's a normal thing to get, and suddenly somebody comes in, they just got a pack of crackers or something, and maybe you don't even like it. You don't even look. You're still talking. You're excited about the project, and you go, no one is interested in that anymore. I mean, how can you be? If you just, I was just starving. What'd you have? I don't even remember. I was just starving. Somebody had something I ate. I was feeling terrible. I had to get my mind back together to finish the project. Nowadays, if you're sophisticated, if you're ordinary, which all of you are, then it's more a matter of dining. It's not just eating to stay alive. That is a primary activity. It is now a secondary. It is a hobby. Nothing wrong with it. But it is now an endeavor. It is now an act as opposed to a fact. And so I can say, or as Kyroots did, in a sense they begin to supplant. The more that life progresses, the facts begin to supplant the acts. Now, of course, not literally, because if I say that dining becomes more important than eating, and you say, I can follow that, it doesn't actually supplant it, because you can't dine without eating. You're still eating. But you understand, it begins to actually, you get to see it, supplant it. Because you said if you ask somebody, you don't go eat. Unless they're starving, your good friend, your girlfriend, your boyfriend. You say, hey, you don't go eat? Now, if you just meant it literally, that's all it was. Because if it was just go eat, you might just go in the kitchen and play like root hogs. Just fall down your stomach by a cabinet and rip open a box of prunes or something. You pour cereal on the floor. That is not what people mean nowadays. If you say you want to go eat, what they're really saying is, do you want to go dine? What they're saying is, do you want to go engage in a social, which is secondary, activity? You all know that. It's not that you won't eat and your body gets nutrition out of it, but just to say you want to go eat. And if somebody says, well, yeah. But if you actually meant just that, and you say, well, here. And you hand them a zucchini, and you've had one, and you stuck it in the mouth, and you got through and said, well, what do we do now? They would not consider that there had been much of a social experience with you. They would not consider you, in fact, civilized. They probably wouldn't consider you sane. That's not eating, because what they mean is dining. What they mean is now, it is more a secondary activity than it is a primary. It is more a fact than it is an act. And so it begins to gradually, as this expands, the merry-go-round gets wider, it begins to supplant it. But notice, even that's not true, because you can't dine without eating. But if you eat without dining, you're not really part of the modern world. It is not really a secondary, civilized, full-blown occasion. You're missing part of it. Until next time, this is you saying until next time.